Welcome to the Advanced Faculty Colloquium. I'm Dr. Amara Okonkwo, and with me is Dr. Zora Ellison. Today we undertake a rigorous Jungian excavation of the 12 zodiacal signs, not as personality types, but as archetypal structures of the collective unconscious articulated through the language of celestial geometry.
Exactly. We treat the tropical zodiac as a symbolic mandala of individuation. Each sign is a distinct complex of libido, shadow, and transcendent function. We will move sequentially. Aries through Pisces, integrating classical dignities, modality, elemental dynamics, and Jung's core concepts persona, shadow, anima, animus, and the self.
Let us begin with Aries, cardinal fire, the purest expression of directed libido. Jung would recognize in Aries the archetype of the hero in its most undifferentiated form, the ego's first heroic thrust out of the Euroboric unconscious.
Yet the shadow of Aries is not mere aggression, it is the terror of dissolution. The Aries complex fears the loss of the newly won center of consciousness. That is why the sign's traditional association with Mars carries both the sword of differentiation and the potential for inflation. When the Aries native identifies solely with the heroic persona, the repressed contents return as psychosomatic crises or catastrophic accidents, classic enantiodromia.
Technical note, the exaltation of the sun in Aries is not flattery. It signals that the principle of conscious will finds its purest field of expression here. But without the integrative work of the later signs, that will remains one sided.
Moving to Taurus, fixed Earth, here the libido coagulates. Jung's concept of the reality function is embodied. Taurus is the archetype of the sensuous container, the body as temple of the self. The Venus rulership is critical. Value is no longer abstract, it is incarnated.
The shadow of Taurus is the fear of entropy and the consequent clinging. When the Taurian complex refuses the necessary sacrifice of form, it becomes the dragon of the alchemical work, hoarding rather than transforming. The fixed modality amplifies this. We see it clinically as resistance to analysis itself when the analysis threatens established material security.
Gemini, mutable air, the sign of the Dioscuri, the twin principle. Jung's transcendent function is prefigured here in the constant oscillation between opposing contents. Mercury as ruler is the psychopomp, but also the trickster who can keep the opposites in perpetual non resolution.
The danger is dissociation. The Gemini complex can split the personality into alternating personae so fluidly that no stable ego self axis forms. Yet, when held consciously, Gemini becomes the laboratory of the coincidentia oppositorum. The dual bodied sign is the first clear image of the dialogical psyche.
Cancer, cardinal water, the lunar realm. This is the matrix of the personal unconscious and the first differentiation of the mother complex. Jung's own early work on complexes is almost Cancerian in its attention to feeling toned memory clusters.
The Cancerian shadow is the devouring mother, whether projected outward or introjected as depressive regression. The cardinal impulse of Cancer is protective, but protection can become imprisonment of the emerging ego. The moon's domicile here reminds us that emotional security is the precondition for later heroic and intellectual adventures.
Leo, fixed fire, the solar principle now in its own domicile. This is the archetype of the self as it first appears to the ego, radiant, central, demanding recognition. Jung's concept of the mana personality is pure Leo when inflated.
Precisely. The Leo complex must eventually sacrifice its claim to be the self. That sacrifice is the transition from persona identification to the more humble service of the true self. Without it, we get the tragic inflation of the king who cannot leave the throne. The fixed quality makes this relinquishment particularly difficult and therefore particularly transformative when achieved.
Virgo, mutable earth, Mercury's other domicile. Here, the discriminating function reaches its highest refinement. Virgo is the archetype of the careful separation of the pure from the impure, the beginning of the alchemical opus itself.
Jung would see in Virgo the necessary critical function that prevents the inflation of the previous solar stage. The shadow is the hypercritical complex that turns against the self, producing the sterility of perfectionism. Yet, when integrated, Virgo becomes the servant of the individuation process, the precise attention that allows the gold to be separated from the dross.
Libra, cardinal air, Venus's other home, the archetype of the balanced opposites. Libra is the first clear image of the syzygy, the conscious relating of masculine and feminine principles within the psyche.
The danger is the perpetual postponement of decision in the name of fairness. The Libran complex can become an endless court of justice that never delivers a verdict. Yet the cardinal impulse insists on movement. When successful, Libra initiates the true conjunctio, not as fusion, but as conscious relationship between differentiated contents.
Scorpio, fixed water, Mars's traditional domicile and Pluto's modern one. This is the underworld journey, Jung's night sea voyage, the confrontation with the shadow in its most visceral form. Scorpio demands the death of the persona as the price of transformation.
The fixed modality here is crucial. The Scorpio complex does not dabble in the depths, it remains until the work is complete. The danger is identification with the underworld contents, becoming the very power one sought to transform. The higher octave is the realization that the power was never personal, it belongs to the self.
Sagittarius, mutable fire, Jupiter's domicile, the archetype of the meaning seeking function. Here, the psyche reaches for the teleological. Jung's concept of the spirit as the superior function of orientation toward the whole finds its clearest zodiacal expression.
The shadow is dogmatic inflation, the belief that one's particular meaning system is the universal. The mutable quality allows for the necessary revision of beliefs, but only if the ego does not cling to the role of the prophet. When integrated, Sagittarius becomes the philosophical attitude that can hold multiple perspectives without collapsing into relativism.
Capricorn, cardinal earth, Saturn's domicile, the archetype of the senex and the structure building function. This is the principle of incarnation in time. Jung's emphasis on the necessity of the ego's confrontation with the demands of the collective finds its sternest teacher here.
The Capricornian shadow is the identification with the hierarchical persona, the empty authority that has lost connection to the living self. Yet the cardinal earth impulse is the capacity to build enduring vessels for spirit. Without Capricorn, individuation remains an airy ideal. With it, the work becomes historical and responsible.
Aquarius, fixed air, Saturn's traditional domicile and Uranus's modern one, the archetype of the collective and the breakthrough of new consciousness. Jung's own life work, the exploration of the collective unconscious, is profoundly Aquarian in its scope.
The danger is the dissociation from personal feeling in the name of the collective ideal. The fixed air quality can produce the remote revolutionary who loves humanity in the abstract while remaining incapable of ordinary human relationship. When integrated, Aquarius becomes the capacity to hold the tension between individual uniqueness and collective responsibility.
Finally, Pisces, mutable water. Jupiter's traditional domicile and Neptune's modern one. The return to the Euroboric, but now at a higher octave. This is the dissolution of the hard-won ego boundaries in service of the self. Jung's concept of the unus mundus, the psychoid realm where psyche and matter are not yet divided, finds its zodiacal home here.
The shadow is the refusal of incarnation, the longing to dissolve back into the unconscious without having completed the circuit of individuation. The mutable water quality can produce either the mystic who has earned the right to dissolve or the addict who has not. The highest expression of Pisces is the compassionate identification with all suffering that arises only after the ego has been fully differentiated and then willingly sacrificed.
Looking across the entire sequence, we see the classical alchemical stages encoded in the zodiacal order: the nigredo of Scorpio, the albedo of the air signs discrimination, the rubedo of the fire signs passionate realization, and the final return in Pisces. The tropical zodiac, read through Jung, is nothing less than a map of the individuation process projected onto the ecliptic.
And that is why this faculty insists on technical rigor. Without the precise geometry of the signs, the elements, the modalities, and the planetary dignities, the archetypal reading becomes free floating projection. With them, we possess a disciplined language for the most profound process the human psyche can undergo.
The work continues. We invite our colleagues to test these formulations against clinical material and against their own lived experience of the chart. Only then does the dialogue between astrology and depth psychology become more than theoretical elegance. It becomes a living instrument of transformation.
Before we proceed further, a methodological clarification. We are not performing sun sign astrology. Each sign is examined as a pure archetypal field that can be activated by any planet, house, or angle. The native's experience of Aries, for example, is most intense when the ascendant, sun, moon, or a stellium falls there, or when Mars is prominently configured. The sign is the qualitative field, the planets are the actors within it.
Agreed, and we must remember that Jung himself was cautious about astrology, yet he recognized its value as a symbolic system isomorphic with the structure of the psyche. Our task is to make that isomorphism explicit and technically precise.
Returning to Aries with greater precision. The Mars domicile and solar exaltation create a unique double emphasis on directed energy. In Jungian terms, this is the first successful extraction of ego from the maternal Ouroboros. The crisis of Aries is the inevitable encounter with the limits of pure will. When that limit is denied, we observe the classic Aries shadow manifestations: impulsive rupture of relationships, somatic conversion of unprocessed rage, or the heroic inflation that ends in isolation.
Taurus deepens this. The Venusian valuation process is the psyche's first attempt to establish what is worth preserving. Clinically, we see the Taurian complex most clearly in patients who experience any threat to material or bodily continuity as an existential annihilation. The therapeutic task is to help the complex differentiate between necessary conservation and pathological stasis. The fixed earth modality makes this differentiation slow, which is both its gift and its danger.
Gemini's Mercury is the principle of differentiation itself. Jung's essay on the transcendent function could almost be read as a meditation on the Gemini archetype. The sign's dual nature is not merely communicative, it is the psyche's capacity to hold two mutually exclusive positions long enough for a third, previously impossible position to emerge. When this fails, we get the classic Gemini splitting: the person who is fine in one context and devastated in another, with no bridging ego.
Cancer's lunar field is the repository of the personal unconscious. The cardinal water impulse is the active seeking of emotional security. In analysis, Cancerian material often appears as the first strong resistance, because to examine the feeling toned complexes is to risk the very security the complex was formed to protect. The moon's domicile here teaches us that without a sufficiently stable emotional base, later developmental tasks cannot be sustained.
Leo's solar domicile is the stage on which the ego first experiences itself as the center. Jung's description of the mana personality is almost a clinical description of Leo inflation. The fixed fire quality means the identification once formed is tenacious. The individuation task is the gradual realization that the light one carries is not one's personal possession but a reflection of the self. This realization is experienced subjectively as a crucifixion of the ego's claim to centrality.
Virgo's Mercury in Earth is the critical dissecting function necessary for the alchemical work. Without Virgo's capacity to separate, the previous solar inflation cannot be analyzed. The danger is that the critical function turns against the self itself, producing the sterility Jung warned against when the intellect becomes autonomous. Healthy Virgo serves the individuation process by refining the vessels in which the transformative work occurs.
Libra's Venusian air is the first explicit image of the inner marriage. The syzygy is no longer projected solely onto external partners, it begins to be recognized as an internal drama. The cardinal impulse forces the issue: relationship must be chosen and enacted, not merely contemplated. The shadow appears as the inability to bear the tension of opposing values, leading either to premature compromise or to perpetual indecision.
Scorpio is the Nakia. The fixed water quality means the descent, once begun, cannot be casually abandoned. Jung's own confrontation with the unconscious in the years after the break with Freud has a distinctly scorpionic character: the willingness to remain in the underworld until the transformative process is complete. The modern association with Pluto simply intensifies what was already present in the Mars domicile: the demand for absolute honesty about power, desire, and mortality.
Sagittarius's Jupiterian fire is the teleological function, the psyche's inherent drive toward meaning. When this function is constellated, the individual experiences a pressing need to locate personal suffering within a larger narrative. The mutable quality allows the narrative to be revised, the fire provides the passion that makes the search urgent. The shadow is the capture by a single myth that then excludes all contradictory data.
Capricorn's Saturnian Earth is the principle of incarnation in historical time. Jung insisted that individuation is not a purely inner process, it must become effective in the world. Capricorn is the sign that enforces this requirement. The cardinal impulse initiates the building of structures, careers, institutions, bodies of work that can carry the values of the self into the collective. The shadow is the identification with those structures at the expense of the living connection to the self that alone justifies them.
Aquarius presents the paradox of the fixed air sign. On one hand, the Uranian breakthrough of new consciousness. On the other, the Saturnian demand for enduring form. Jung's own psychology is Aquarian in its scope. It seeks laws of the psyche that are both universal and respectful of individual uniqueness. The danger is the remote idealism that loves the idea of the human while remaining incapable of ordinary relatedness. Integration requires the capacity to hold both the collective vision and the particular human face.
Pisces closes the circle. The mutable water of Jupiter and Neptune is the return to the source, but only after the entire circuit of differentiation has been traversed. Jung's late concept of the unus mundus, the psychoid realm in which psyche and matter are not yet divided, belongs here. The danger is the premature dissolution that bypasses the hard work of the preceding signs. The achievement is the compassionate participation in the suffering of the world that becomes possible only when the ego has first been fully established and then freely relinquished.